We are happy that we have a full panel today. First speaker, as I said, is Maurice Biriotti. He is the CEO of SHM Limited, which is an arts and humanities consultancy based in London and around the globe. He's also the adjunct professor of humanities innovation at Trinity College, Dublin, and he works with the Trinity Long Room Hub on projects about humanities innovation. I'm sure we'll hear about that. Second speaker today, Gráinne Miller. She's the head of cultural development at the Temple Bar Cultural Trust. Our third speaker is Professor John O'Hagan. He is a professor of economics at this college. He also, only 2 days ago, launched the report co-written with Joanna Archbold on creativity, the city and the university, which really deals with how can a university help change a city and, by implication, the world, by tapping into its cultural resources. Our fourth speaker today is Ed Gráinne. His company co-produced the Palme d'Or winning The Wind That Shakes the Barley. I'm sure we are all familiar with that. He is a co-founder of the film production company Element Pictures, and he really brings a strong practitioner element to the debate. So we are happy that we have a panel that really ranges from the hard social sciences through a broad spectrum of humanities experiences and competences, right to the artistic, performative edge. Today's forum is about leadership, and arts and humanities need to show leadership in a time of great anxiety and a time of worry about what will the future bring. Clearly, the old model of just relying on profitability as the sole guiding source for society has led us down some blind alleys. Clearly, there has been a discussion in the last 2 years about, have we lost our moral compass? Can we regenerate our societies by tapping into some of the wisdom, some of the beauty of the arts and humanities? Will we be able to rediscover new keys to better living, cultural harmony, or at least cultural exchange? Will we be able to re-energize our businesses? So today's brief really is for the panel to explore how the arts and cultural spheres can contribute to revitalize society in Ireland, but of course with lots of perspectives to the outside world. Without further ado, we really need to get the ball rolling, and I call on Maurice Biriotti to really lead the game. You can stand up here or sit, whatever you want.
Thank you very much. A quick apology. I have a very bad cold, so I'm finding it difficult to project my voice, but I'm going to ask that really stupid question now, because it is done, isn't it? Can people hear me? Actually, that's very clear. Thank you very much. There's always one, isn't there, in every university. Thank you for that. I was told to keep this brief and crisp, and I was also told that it needed to be a very informal presentation, and I find myself in really not that informal a space, so you'll forgive me for having not necessarily having the full sort of PowerPoint presentation for you. I'm going to try instead to speak a little bit about my own experiences I hasten to add that up until now, my experiences have been based in London. I'm British, I work in London. And for the last few months, I've been working with Paul and colleagues at Trinity to see if there's any value in bringing some of the things that I've experienced in my career to this country. And it's very early days for me, and I'm hoping today will teach me about what is and isn't possible. So I'm actually very optimistic about getting some great ideas from all of you today. Let me explain what it is that I do, because it is a little bit unusual. And some of you may have heard this before, and if you have, I'm sorry, but everything I want to say, all the points I want to make, rather depend on the experience that I've had personally to make sense. I used to be an academic in the humanities, and I did love it. And I was really, really passionate about it, and I continue to be passionate about it. And I continue to be passionate about it when it is delightfully and almost aggressively and militantly pointless. And sometimes people feel very proud of the fact that what they do doesn't have a specific social use, and that research for research's sake is something that people can indulge in. I personally believe, for a number of reasons, that this is absolutely crucial. And I would fight hard for the right of people to continue to do great scholarship in those sorts of areas. And not only that, but to get more funding for it. And it's one of the things that I've tried to make into a personal mission and a personal crusade. However, when I was an academic, that wasn't what I wanted to do. I didn't want to do the humanities just for the humanities' sake. I had a profound belief that the stuff that I was interested in and the stuff that I did had real relevance to the world outside. And this seemed to me to be borne out by just the normal common sense experience that I had day to day. Every time I had a conversation with someone, it seemed to link to something in my research. Every time I went to see a film or read something in the newspaper, it seemed to link to my research. It seemed to me that all of the topics that I was interested in as a humanities scholar were actually topics that mattered a great deal in society. And I personally wanted to find a way to create a dialogue between the very best scholarship as I perceived it in the humanities and some of the social sciences on the one hand, and the world out there, if you like, on the other hand. Now, I'm not alone in doing this. There are lots of examples of this happening, but I had a particular end in mind, which was to say that I believed that, and I continue to believe, that most of the problems faced by people who want to transform the world, or people who want to do good business, or people who want to create good policies out there, most of the problems that really keep people awake at night are human problems. Actually, some of the difficulties that we get into that are technical are horrendously difficult, but they can usually be resolved with a certain degree of ingenuity. The problems that seem to us to be intractable, really tough to get at, are the problems to do with human beings, what motivates them, how they behave, how they interact. And it seemed to me that this was the absolute stuff of the humanities. I decided for a number of reasons in 1996 that I wanted to stop being a full-time academic, and I wanted to set up my own company to try and put some of these ideas into practice. And I'm not going to tell you the whole story. I'm going to give you a few examples of our work because they might be pertinent for today, and perhaps they'll stimulate some discussion anyway. But I will say that today I run an organisation that's not enormous, but I have about 50 people who work for me. We work pretty much all over the world. We do a lot of work in the States, in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and across Europe. And our work, some of it is about social transformation. I hope to tell you a little bit about that. Some of it is in the public sector, and some of it is in the private sector. When I started getting interested in this area, one of the big topics that seemed to come up with everybody that I came across, who could be a potential customer of ours, if you like, was this question of leadership. And I was astonished at what I discovered in the field of leadership. There seemed to be hundreds and hundreds of people making absolute fortunes out of what seemed to me to be gobbledygook, utter nonsense. Cobbled together ideas from, bad understandings of religion and spirituality, strange interpretations of psychology, strange interpretations of anthropology, strange interpretations of philosophy. And there were even books that I picked up that seemed to be getting an enormous amount of currency, which when I looked at them from the lens of a humanities expert, just seemed to me to be bad academia, very bad academia. Now, maybe, I thought, that's fine, because actually, when you work in the world of business or you work in the world of policy making, maybe what really matters is the result. And actually, this stuff that seems to me to be gobbledygook is actually really, really effective. Well, it isn't, is my experience. It's gobbledygook in and gobbledygook out. There's an enormous amount of stuff that people in businesses and in the public sector have to do in the field of developing their leadership, which feels to me to be insane. And it doesn't generate fantastic results. It doesn't generate leaders who are both inspired and inspiring. It just generates a whole weird language of stuff that in the end, I'm not sure means anything at all. And one of the things I wanted to do, it's one aspect of my business, was to say, I think the arts and humanities could do better than this. I think by talking to some of the best scholars in literature, in philosophy, etc., we might be able to do something that is both a more intelligent set of inputs for people to think about and potentially generate some better outputs. I'm happy to say that my experience has been that that's what's happened. And you know, one of the reasons why our business is growing today and has actually bucked the trend of the recession pretty successfully and has been growing every year since '96, I think is because we do this pretty well. I wanted to give you a few quick examples. The first is in the field of simple sort of management stuff, management speak, management development. One of the things I noticed was happening in the 90s, and it's gone on over the last decade, is that there's been a great deal of talk about the fact that great managers, great leaders, are people who somehow get in touch with themselves. They're people who somehow get in touch with what is truly authentic about themselves. And who could disagree with that? Who could disagree with the notion of authenticity? And you have courses and courses that are dedicated to becoming an authentic leader, showing your people an authentic side of yourself, showing the true you. Bring yourself to work is one of the slogans. And it seemed to me that this stuff was the kind of gobbledygook that I was talking about before. Because rather than creating a series of possibilities for leaders precisely to become more authentic, it felt to me, certainly particularly coming into this in the 1990s, that what there was instead was a whole load of very inauthentic speak precisely. That we'd created a kind of weird language that people were supposed to adopt, that nobody liked, nobody understood, but somehow they had to take it on and prove to everybody, look guys, this is how authentic I'm being. That seemed to me to be completely the wrong way to go about it. I'm only going to give very quick examples, so I'll give a very quick example of one of the ways in which we've tried to address this. One of the ways in which we tried to address this was we said, well, you know, if we look at this question of authenticity and leadership, are there things in the humanities that might help us? And we talked to experts in literature. One of the experts in literature was a professor of Shakespearean studies, who helped us to do a really, I think, very exciting analysis of Henry V. And he talked about a particular kind of difficulty that there is in Henry V, which is that in Henry V, just before Agincourt, the king is about to take on a whole load of people. And actually, he thinks he's going to lose. But he can't say he's going to lose, because if he says he's going to lose, then he's almost certain that he will lose. So what he has to do is to create one of the most extraordinary speeches in literature in order to try and convince people that they will win. And then they do win. Now that creates some really quite interesting problems. Was that speech authentic? Well, yeah, they did win in the end. But at the time, he probably didn't think that they would win. He was the sort of player king. He was pretending. He was acting. Was it authentic or was it inauthentic? Very interestingly, as we started to develop this theme with a group of academics, actually, we realised that there was something really, really important in it about authenticity. And we took this to a number of public sector and private sector organisations and started really working it through. And when we did, we were able to come up with some ways of tackling this theme that seemed to us to be much, much, much more realistic. And here's the rub, if you like, of why it was so much more realistic. Because it seems to me that when we study the humanities, we don't come to simple pat answers. What we come to instead is questions. We come to the right kind of formulation of questions. And the world, unfortunately, isn't about pat answers. If it were, then we would know how to lead all the time. We'd have sorted this out years ago. We'd have sorted out what a great leader looks like. We haven't. We have to keep on reinventing it because the context changes, the ethical mood changes, the issues that confront us change, etc. We never quite definitively work out what leadership is. And so my first proposition is that the arts and humanities can help us in the field of literature because they have a particular way of dealing with questioning and contradiction which is suited to the reality of being a leader. My second example is in the field of social transformation. One of the things that when we set up our company we decided that we would do is that we would absolutely be a for-profit company, but we would turn as much of our profit as possible into social transformation projects around the world that we felt passionately about. And we started doing a great deal of work in Mexico, just for other reasons, for business reasons, a few years ago. And we found out that in the communities that we were working with, for business reasons, in the communities we were working with, there was a very particular kind of difficulty, a very particular kind of problem, almost an unspoken problem, which was that in many rural communities there were many, many people who were HIV positive. And although they were HIV positive, a terrible thing to be HIV positive, for them, they weren't able to talk about this with their communities for all sorts of social reasons. And on top of that, many of them lived 6 or 7 hours drive away from the nearest clinic, and finding out information, finding other people who were HIV positive, etc., was extremely difficult for them. Now, we studied the way in which, if you like, the various organisations around the place had tried to lead their way out of this difficulty. How do you create a situation where these people can be better supported? The first question is, does it matter? Yes, it does matter. It matters a great deal. There's a good deal of strong, pretty hard evidence, actually, to suggest that when people have good social networks, they end up taking their meds. And when people take their meds, they live for longer. And if people don't have good social networks, they don't take their meds, and terrible things happen. There's also some evidence to suggest they don't necessarily behave in the right kinds of ways, and they end up spreading the disease unless they have good contact with other people. So this seemed to us to be a very real kind of problem. And we thought, okay, what if we, instead of taking a sort of scientific look at this, and instead of taking a political look at this, what if we were to take an arts and humanities approach to this? And what we did was we tried to study the stories that people told us. We went to meet a lot of these people who were HIV positive, and we asked them to tell us stories. And we started studying the narratives that they gave us, and we used some of the skills of narrative analysis that I knew about as a scholar in literature, and that some of my colleagues in different universities helped me to work through the analysis of. And what we discovered was some really quite interesting stuff. One of the things that we discovered was the importance of forming rapid social connection in the way in which these people thought about information. Information for them was always linked to social connection. That is to say, I don't find out something because it's a fact and I download it and put it into my brain. A fact only exists socially. We felt we discovered through the work that we did with these individuals. So we wondered to ourselves, well, first of all, it'd be very interesting to have a bit more data about when these people talk to each other, how they talk to each other, etc. And secondly, what we really need to do in order to be able to solve the problem is to get people very, very, very simply to be able to have connections with each other. We did something really, really straightforward. As a result of this analysis, very straightforward, we gave people mobile phones and we hooked them up to a social network such that each person could send a text message, and the text message would be received simultaneously by 9 other people. So they were in groups of 10. That was it. And we just told them, text away, go ahead, as many SMSs as you want to. The only thing is you just have to understand we can read the stuff. Several things happened as a result of this. One was that these guys texted vast amounts of stuff. And that provided us with fantastic insights into what was really going on socially for them, because we were able to work with a group of humanities scholars and literary experts to analyse these text message strings as dialogues, almost as if they were plays that were written. And by doing that, we came up with some really exciting insights about what goes on for people in those sorts of circumstances. Second thing that happened, just so you know, is that the take-up of texting was so significant among the 40 people in the trial that it brought one of the telephone systems in Latin America to its knees. They sent loads of SMSs. Third thing that happened was that about 85% of the messages sent were relevant to their condition, even though we didn't tell them that they had to be. And finally, extraordinary things happened just as we'd predicted to do with the nature of information. Somebody asked a really simple question right at the beginning. He said, it's a horrible story actually, he said, I have had an abscess in my tooth for 3 years. Every time I go to the dentist, I'm a good Catholic, and I'm asked the question, are you HIV positive? I say yes, I know it's confidential, I don't want other people to know, but I tell the dentist. And the dentist says, I won't treat you. I've not been able to get my abscess sorted out. Can anyone help? He had 3 recommendations for a dentist within 2 seconds. He trusted them, where all of the recommendations that had come to him through various very expensive means of getting information out there to these people before had not been trusted by them, by him before. He trusted them, and the next day he wrote a message to the group saying, thank you very much, I've had my abscess sorted out. That pattern of story was repeated every day throughout the 3-month trial. We're now repeating the trial in South Africa jointly with the University of Yale and trying to figure out if we can expand it. My first example, if you like, was an example of how, as Paul put it before, the soft sciences can help you with some of the hard things that need to happen in business. I believe that business is complicated, policy making is complicated, working in the public sector is complicated. Reducing things down to simplistic slogans won't work. We have a wealth of extraordinary methodologies and extraordinary knowledge of learning out there, and we have brilliant people in institutions like these who deal with that level of complexity every single day. We should be making use of that. And my second proposition is that we ought to try and invite the arts and humanities to the table at problem solving, because when we do invite them to the table at problem solving, they come up with answers that are radically different and sometimes surprisingly simple and can make a difference. So that's my proposition. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maurice, for setting us off to a great start. Our second speaker this afternoon is Gráinne Miller. I'm sure we'll be hearing about Temple Bar, Dublin.
You will have a number of slides?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. If you want to do we see the slides?
Yeah,
If you turn off the stage.
where do I do that? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Okay, well, I think it's fair to say that it's been well documented at this stage that culture, creativity and the arts are recognised as an intrinsic part of our economic and social recovery, both here in Ireland and across the globe. And if you don't mind, I'll just remind you of a few of the policy documents that have been circulating around the last year. In the last few weeks, more recently, the Ministers of Culture of the EU have gathered for an informal meeting in Barcelona, where they unanimously approved to put culture at the heart of the 2020 strategy. And a green paper will be published on that later this month. Here at home, we have the government's Smart Economy, which acknowledges the arts and culture, creativity, our primary economic contributors to our recovery, stating that further investment in this area must be based on world-class ambition and achievement, as well as a strong sense of civic engagement. The recent Innovation Task Force report also recognises that arts and humanities, culture and the creative industries have a unique contribution to make to certain sectors of the economy, But what's interesting in this is they state that the precise role that culture and the arts can play is still less developed and misunderstood or less understood. Here in Dublin, we have the Dublin City Development Plan, which for the first time places culture as one of the 6 themes of this strategic plan for the development of Dublin over the next number of years. So for the first time, culture has a formal seat at the table alongside the economy, the environment and other areas. So I think that really represents very significant policy developments for the arts and cultural community. And while they may not acknowledge the role of art for art's sake or culture for culture's sake, I think these developments represent great opportunities for those of us working in the cultural sector to lead the way and position arts and culture at the heart of our national, social and economic interests and play a key role in shaping our future. Because of this, I believe that it's really vitally important that the culture and arts sector lead the way and that we lead this conversation, setting out our vision for culture, our vision for the arts and the creative industries, so that together we can begin to create the right kind of conditions for culture and creativity to flourish. However, when I looked through some of the submissions to a number of those reports I mentioned, it was actually quite disappointing to see that the arts and cultural sector really did not probably engage as well as they could have in the process. While I believe that the community of artists, cultural practitioners and creatives have a responsibility to take a leadership role here, I think we need to find ways of making our sector more understood in a practical and tangible way. So I'm just going to give you a practical example of how this happened in Temple Bar. These are just some of the faces of Temple Bar, some of which you may recognise, others you may not. But if we look back to the late 80s, when the Temple Bar area was under threat of and in danger of being demolished and turned into a bus depot for Dublin, it was actually the community of artists and conservationists and archaeologists and artists and architects who all came together, and they met informally in coffee shops, they met in bars, and they were brought together by this need to figure out how they were actually going to save this important historic and cultural area of Dublin. They organised themselves into a group and they lobbied the government quite vigorously to protect Temple Bar. And the results of that were in 1991, the area was granted, funding from the European Union, and it launched itself as Dublin's cultural quarter to coincide with Dublin being the capital of culture in 1991. And I think, it's easy for us to forget, with the passing of time, how pioneering and extraordinary this initiative was, that was led by a community of artists and cultural practitioners. There were a number of key factors, I suppose, to the success. And there was a very strong vision of what people wanted Temple Bar to be. It was a culture-led regeneration, using culture, the grassroots community coming together to say that culture will be the catalyst for the social, economic and physical regeneration of this really important part of Dublin. The second element, and the critical element, was leadership. This group of activists in Temple Bar, they lobbied the government, and at the time it was Charles Haughey who was our Taoiseach. And he championed this proposal, and he brought it to Europe. And he introduced new legislation to facilitate the development of the creation of Temple Bar as a cultural quarter. An essential part of the regeneration project was the delivery mechanism. How are we actually going to turn our vision into a reality? And so new structures were set up. A new company was set up, which had a very unique structure. It had a clear cultural mandate. And while its job was to manage a regeneration project, culture was at the core of this. And it was also a not-for-profit company. So any profits that came in from the development were always going to go back into the cultural development to ensure that the cultural community would be supported and developed. And then the fourth element of it really had to do with how the Temple Bar project then was marketed, both within Dublin, Ireland and internationally, as a new cultural tourism destination for Dublin. And the results of this are really quite astonishing. When you think about what we have today, over 50,000 people use the Temple Bar area, and I'm glad to say that actually a very high percentage of those, in around 60%, are Dubliners, contrary to popular belief. The area has also created and supported 300 small businesses. There's over 2,500 people living in the area. And most importantly, the cultural infrastructure is made up of over 50 cultural buildings and spaces. And there's hundreds of performances, workshops, recordings, rehearsals, paintings, and artists working there on a daily basis. And I suppose in terms of its economic input, the turnover is estimated at over 676 million a year, which is quite astonishing. What's also really interesting about the Temple Bar project is that it has been a model which has been taken across Ireland, where towns like Kilkenny, Donegal, Sligo, they're all developing their own cultural quarters to underpin economic growth and sustainable development. And Temple Bar continues to attract, as it has always done, policymakers, planners, students, cultural practitioners from all over the world to learn from the experience of this integrated, joined-up approach to urban renewal with culture at its core. So what we have today in Temple Bar and what we have in the city is a stable and sustainable environment for artists and creative practitioners who are protected from market forces. This has led to an enormous concentration of cultural activity and creative imagination that flows through the area on a daily basis. And with an investment of over 10 million of Arts Council funding in the area, Temple Bar represents a very significant part of the cultural infrastructure of Dublin and Ireland. So what does that mean for us today? Well, the biggest challenge for us at Temple Bar Cultural Trust is to find ways and to lead the way in finding practical, user-friendly ways to bring culture closer to the city, to people, to the cultural organisations of the city, and to the process of social and economic renewal of Dublin and the country. One of the most successful ways we've done that in the last few years has been through an initiative called Culture Night. It was launched back in 2006, and the whole idea really was to find a way of connecting the cultural buildings and spaces within Temple Bar with the wider city of Dublin, so that we could find a new and imaginative way to engage the public and to encourage them to participate more in the cultural life of the city. And what we asked the cultural buildings to do was simply to open up their buildings and spaces until midnight for one night of the year. And in the first year, we had 40 organisations on board and 40,000 visitors. So, I mean, that in itself was quite an extraordinary response in the first year. And yes, it's a relatively simple concept, but what has happened since then in the course of the last 4 years has been quite extraordinary. Last year, 150,000 people came to Culture Night in Dublin alone. Over 125 cultural buildings and spaces ranging from our cathedrals, museums, galleries, the cultural community of Trinity College here, the Book of Kells, for instance, surpassed and broke all of its own attendance records in the summers with over 5,000 people visiting it on this one night. It has, and for the first time what Culture Night did was to actually bring together all of the cultural organisations in the city. For me, having worked in Temple Bar for the last 10 years, I really realised we have an enormous wealth and richness of cultural infrastructure, but we just haven't been so good at actually telling people about it or promoting it. The other element of Culture Night was really about, as I say, it was really about encouraging the public who might not normally come to our cultural institutions to participate, and we made it as user-friendly as possible so that senior citizens would be out on the street feeling safe at night on a Friday night. We had young children participating in workshops, making films, making art, participating in contemporary dance workshops. There were, if any of you were around on Culture Night, you'll have seen the numbers of buggies and children and kids kind of running around the streets at 10, 11 o'clock at night on a Friday, transforming our everyday experience of the city. And I think that's what's been so strong about Culture Night, is the power that the cultural community can have by working together to completely redesign and reimagine how our city could be if we take the leadership and bring culture to the fore. We also conducted research on Culture Night, and again, the feedback that we've been getting from the public has been really, really interesting. For instance, 90% of people coming to Culture Night were coming for their first time. So every year we've been attracting a whole new audience, a whole new public for cultural activities. At the same time, we've also found that a huge percentage of those people are visiting our cultural facilities for the first time. And I think that, these kind of figures, I think, really challenge us as people working in the cultural sector to ask ourselves, what can we do to, why is it that these people are only coming once a year? Like, what is it that we need to do to make sure that our cultural organisations are become part of a normal kind of everyday experience for people? We also asked people, what were the barriers then that were preventing them from participating in our cultural life, and very practical things such as information or lack of information, lack of knowledge, lack of awareness, and then other areas such as cost and time. So again, I think we just need to take these. We need to take what we're hearing on board and look at strategies to address this. We also asked the public what they believed were the most important cultural attractions in the city, and you'll be very glad to hear that Trinity College was in the top 5. We asked this question specifically to a younger audience as well, like from 16 to 18, just to kind of get a sense of their views. And it was quite interesting because what they had said in terms of their top cultural attractions was very similar to the older kind of public. But one thing they did include was the Spire, so I thought that was kind of as a kind of recent landmark, I suppose, in our city. I thought that was just interesting that holds a place for them. So the other thing that has come out of Culture Night is this idea of creating, if we were to define our city by culture, this is what it might look like. So for the purpose of Culture Night itself, we broke the city up into cultural quarters so that geographical areas were distinguished by their unique cultural identity. So while it may not be so clear here, there are 6 cultural quarters. A very obvious one is Temple Bar in the centre, but we have Trinity College and the emerging cultural hub down at the Docklands. And 3 or 4 others. But what makes this really interesting is that it's our unique cultural kind of our heritage and our contemporary culture, which is what's kind of mapping our city. And I'm hoping that we might actually get to a point where we have a cultural map for Dublin that people can use, because we don't have one at the moment, which is kind of something that you would expect as a kind of major European capital city. So in terms of the future then, Culture Night is just one night of the year, but it does highlight the potential of our culture and our creativity to redefine us. And so what I believe is that we do need a new kind of, a new vision for Dublin in particular, I suppose, as it is the engine of our economy. And we do need new kinds of leadership and governance, and we also need new ideas. So if I just go back to the area of leadership, if we take the fact that over 200 million euro of taxpayers' money is spent annually in Dublin on mainstream cultural services and facilities, ranging from art, film, libraries, the national institutions, it doesn't include the state and private funding for 3rd and 4th level education or funding for the design and creation of audiovisual content. that's a huge amount of money going into the city, but there's absolutely no coherent or strategic purpose to any of this. It's coming from various different organisations, and it's very hard to see how this kind of fragmented way of working can really help to contribute to our recovery. I think the proposal to elect a directly elected mayor for Dublin could provide an opportunity to review how the Dublin region itself supports and organises culture and creative resources. And I think, because I think we have an opportunity to really increase our capacity to provide creative and original thinking, and to position ourselves as one of the most creative cities, if not in Europe, indeed in the world. And if we look to places like London, Oslo, Paris, the role of a directly elected mayor has had a very significant role to play, I suppose, in the promotion and leadership of culture and the creative industries. I think that Dublin, especially, also urgently needs a strategic promotional campaign to harness all of these separate initiatives that are taking place across the city. Because I think only by pooling our ideas and resources will we be able to support a new brand for Dublin City that positions us as high quality, creative, cultural city of international standing that really stands out for its distinctiveness and its quality of cultural offer. I think when you look at the success of places like Edinburgh, for instance, there's been a dramatic impact on their city simply by coming together and branding the city as a cultural place. Their festivals alone have all, in the last few years, increased in ticket sales and visitor numbers. It's had a knock-on effect in the economy. So we all stand to benefit by taking this kind of joined-up approach. There are a number of initiatives underway in the city which are all so laudable and very exciting. There's the UNESCO bid for Dublin as a city of literature. There's also a bid for the UNESCO City of Music. The Georgian Society have just recently put in a bid for the historic quarter of Dublin to become a World Heritage Site. We have the Cultural Odyssey, the City of Science designation. There's talk of going for a World Design Capital bid. And then the other day we had the report on creativity, the city and the university, which came out here of Trinity College Dublin. But I really think unless we have a much more strategic approach to where we're going, we're not really going to fully harness and utilise the potential of what we have. And at Temple Bar Cultural Trust, we've been invited by the City Council to set up a Dublin Cultural Alliance, which I suppose may be a first step, in bringing together a strategic grouping to harness these ideas and opportunities. So just one final idea that I'd like to leave you with, and I wasn't quite sure whether to include this or not, but I think I will, is the idea of revisiting a proposal that came up a few years ago around doing something magical with the Poolbeg chimneys. And as you know, the chimneys have now been closed down, but they are probably one of the most recognisable landmarks in Dublin. For decades, they've featured in films, paintings, photographs, videos, and there's an argument that they should be protected. So maybe they could now be turned into an iconic symbol for Dublin that might help us to visually translate our creative talents and ambitions into a new vision and a gateway for the city. I was kind of reminded of this when I read recently in the Irish Times about the Spitalau, I think, thermal waste treatment plant in Vienna, which has become a considerable source of national pride when they invited a prestigious artist to kind of redesign the tower. So I have a picture of it here. Well, these are Poolbeg, and this is the thermal waste treatment plant, which now attracts thousands of visitors every year and is a visual icon of creativity and pride for the people of Vienna and Austria. So, thank you.
Thank you, Grania. I think we've got two excellent cases to discuss now. Clearly, there can be no doubt that the arts and humanities have a lot to contribute. And we have heard stories which really tell about the power of social innovation. I think that's the connecting thread through the first two presentations, that although the arts and humanities are not primarily concerned with creating new technologies, what we really do and what changes the world dramatically is that we think about how people communicate, how we bring people together. And if you change the rules of the game, magic happens. And that's what actually the arts and humanities may help create. So we are catalysts in many ways of social disorder, social change, social transformation. Leadership, of course, is crucial in that respect. So one of the problems is that the arts and humanities may contribute so much, and yet we are not really having the full impact. So something is missing sometimes. And I'm just throwing that out while you've been thinking about your comments, questions to the first two panelists. And of course the other two panel members may also want to contribute at this stage, although you shouldn't, of course, reveal what you'll be talking to us after the break. But right, yes, up there. And please introduce yourself.
All right, okay. My name is Lucy Masterson, and I lecture American students here in Ireland. And I'm just fascinated that the two, I didn't catch the beginning, apologies, of your talk, but the whole social networking is extraordinary, because when you sit in a class, you just see, you have to actually tell them, put that computer down, please, because after everything is online. But I was fascinated with what you were saying. A couple of things I wanted to ask you, because exactly to your last point about the pool bag, I see my students, they look at this city in completely different eyes, and through them, I actually kind of see, wow, there's so many special things. And the amount of times that they will come in and say, oh, did you buy, I saw that here, or what does that mean, or you've seen this in here. And they've actually mentioned, what are those two candy floss things? They've actually brought that up in class. What are they about? And oh, they're just the old pool bag. That's the whole thing. So I love your idea about that and actually creating something, rather than building something from scratch, as we all talked about, the kind of YouTube towers or whatever else. Maybe look at some of the stuff that we have and build around that. But I wanted to ask you on the research. When you say 90% of the people who visit Culture Night were coming in the first time, do you notice a skew? Were they largely foreigners or tourists, or was that a surge of Irish people coming in and enjoying the night? Because it just would be really interesting to see if there was a night where there wasn't that sense of the Temple Bar stag party factor. I wonder, is that an opportunity, and is it a frustration for you as well that the whole thing has been lumped with this stag party thing, and does that inhibit the artists and developing it as a creative quarter, as opposed to kind of a drinking emporium where everybody kind of arrives in off the plane and heads straight for Temple Bar? So I know there's a couple of questions there, but I'm just really curious on your feedback on that, with Temple Bar specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose just in response to the comment about Temple Bar, stag party and so on, which is a little bit, I suppose, jaded topic at this stage. I suppose that's something that's moved on. It came with cheap flights and Ryanair back in the early 90s, and there are cheap flights to other places around Europe, so this stag ends, I found somewhere more interesting to go. I think I suppose, in relation to Temple Bar, I think perhaps there is an issue around daytime, nighttime personality. And certainly we've actually just launched a couple of new initiatives now which are geared towards the over 55s to encourage them to use Temple Bar and the cultural facilities more often during the day, during the week, and that's been enormously successful. So I think a big part of it is actually designing programs for particular target markets. And one of the challenges, I suppose, that we all find in the cultural sector is just is just finding the resources to market ourselves and to break through kind of to get our message through, and I think so I think the success of Culture Night, for instance, where we've harnessed like the resources and energy of so many different organisations shows that a critical mass actually and a collective effort is going to be much more powerful than any one organisation. So Temple Bar, I mean, on Culture Night itself, anybody who's been there was amazing. I mean, there were just hundreds of kids and babies and older people, you know, very happily walking around until 10, 11, participating in workshops, performances. So I think we perhaps you know, I think sometimes perhaps we have a tendency to knock and to look at the negative aspects of our resources, our, you know, our kind of our riches, I suppose. And you know, I think we really need to embrace them. But I think we have to work in designing programs that are for Dubliners in Dublin, so that people feel a sense of connection and pride and involvement. And in terms of the visitors to Culture Night, they're all Irish, Dubliners predominantly, yeah, across the city. Very small percentage of overseas visitors.
Thank you. Up there.
Hello. My name is Martha Howard, and I'm a resident of Temple Bar. I lived there for 12 years, and I love Anya. And I believe that the cultural whole ethos and what you are trying to establish, I do believe that you have a desire for that to be true, that your words are, you know, you want it to be like that, but in reality it's not like that. I'm a resident, and I have to say I'm fed up, you know, I don't want to sound too negative, but I'm fed up repeating myself. I've sat at forums for years. I gave up 3 years ago, trying to have the cultural aspect of that area do what it says, and it doesn't do that. And I believe that if you really truly listen to us residents, as you said, there's 3,000 of us, and what's happening is it could be a wonderful place. I believe that the cultural night is a wonderful place because the people who come in bring the vibe with them, and that's what's wonderful. What's disappointing is they go away disappointed, because when they come in they're expecting a lot of culture and it's not there. You know, it isn't there. And I would like to see it being there. We have wonderful musicians, we have wonderful storytellers, we have wonderful, you put on wonderful plays and things like that. And as I feel that the marketing aspect, you believe your own delusion. And if you want to get real, listen to people. Because we want to see it as a cultural place. I spend lots of time, I go out of my way for the tourists when they're looking for a place. If I'm in a rush, I'll bring them to the area because they can't actually find what they're looking for. And I feel that it's sad because the people tell me, I ask them the right questions, and what they give me is, we're disappointed, it's dirty, it's overpriced. And I've been saying that for years, and I'm considered a nuisance. And I'm sorry to say, I have to say it again.
All right, thank you. We have quite a few people who want to speak, so before I give Granted the opportunity, I just want to hear, you have a question, you had a question, and up there was one. So any one of you also wants to address the question of Temple Bar? Is your question related to Temple Bar?
It's kind of brought up by this whole discussion.
All right.
But it's in a bigger context.
Okay. And that question, is that about Temple Bar?
2 questions, one is related.
All right. And up there? You had a question about Temple Bar?
Broadly.
All right. Okay, let's do the Temple Bar stuff now first. So you can ask your or
It's just
make your comment.
interesting to me. My name is Maurice. I'm developing a project called The Limit Space with Kathy here. We're bringing together Icelandic and Irish artists, leading edge thinkers, and technology, society, and three pillars really of technology, society, and culture, in order in some way to create social change. And what's really interesting I find with this discussion is that while Temple Bar has opened access to 150,000 people in one night.
Sorry, it's the city.
Oh,
It's the city.
A city.
Dublin,
Okay, yeah, sorry. But while it has allowed that sense of openness and people attracted that number of people, that there are other stories there. And I think when we start to think in terms of flatlands, in terms of just having a strategy for Dublin or for Ireland and isolating the arts, the real gift comes when we hear the stories, when people hear the stories and we collaborate together. And so it doesn't keep the arts as something that's isolated or something that doesn't necessarily cause or help us to bring social change. That if you can bring what you were saying, Maurice, about the communication plus culture plus society and bring it all into that nexus, that point of connection, then that's when we really start to see social change. So what is amazing about Temple Bar is what it has achieved, but I think the next step is to bring in the technology, and the stories of this lady here and stories of people, so that we can move from there and use that nexus to bring us into the next place.
Thank you. We have one question.
I think it's a sort of follow-up from that comment. I mean, I would like to hear from Rhoda what her view is that Temple Bar has contributed to the sort of cultural development and activities of the country, not the 150,000 people, but you talked about the strategic objectives of the Temple Bar and Cultural Trust. Like, what is the long-term aim and ambitions, and what is the desired end result of all of those activities, other than just hundreds of kids around the street on one Friday night or whatever it happens to be. I mean, there's heavy drinking and culture light, but what is what's the desired outcome in the longer term?
Thank you.
Yeah, more broad point. I think you know when you're in trouble when you hear venture capitalists talk about culture. And I see Temple Bar as an example of the culture is something to consume and to be branded and to be marketed. And when we look at what's happening down in Grand Canal Dock as well, when a new theatre like that is lauded and it's forgotten that it's in fact being programmed by a global conglomerate. So I think what we have to remember that we're not just talking about economic revitalisation. In fact, culture has very little part to play, as far as I'm concerned, in economic revitalisation. That it has to be a participative culture we're talking about. And I think it's very ironic if you take the example of Temple Bar, those very same cafes and bars and cooperative people met to defend that part of the city were gone within 2 years with rising rents. And now it's also interesting again that we see a number of new cafes and galleries have opened throughout the city, and coincidentally not in the centre of the city, but in the peripheral centre of the city as rents have gone down. So the argument has to be much broader than the economy and how we consume.
All right, Ron.
Few comments in there. I suppose just picking up on Martha Rose's point, I suppose my response is the fact that from our point of view, 50,000 people visit Temple Bar on a daily basis, so people vote with their feet, and there's obviously something there that they want to visit, so we can't necessarily argue with that. I think was it Mary Kennedy, what you're talking about there is the need to make sure that art isn't isolated from the other elements of society. I think the point I was making in my my presentation earlier on about the opportunities are there actually for the culture and arts and creatives to make that contribution as well, like through the various different policy documents that came out through the government and the various task force. So I think the arts and culture community need to take more of a responsibility as well to actually state their case and to outline their vision, because if they don't do that, it's going to be somebody else who will do that, and it won't be the best one, I suppose, to to create the right kind of conditions, I suppose, that we need in order for culture and creativity to flourish. So I do think that the arts cultural community have to take responsibility to make sure that they're part of the bigger conversation that's going on socially and on social and economically. You asked what Temple Bar Cultural Trust is doing. I mean, our mission, and I said it there in the presentation, is to bring culture closer, and we do that through a huge range of activities. I suppose fundamentally we provide cultural buildings and spaces to artists at very, very heavily discounted costs. So basically we would, I suppose you could say almost subsidise arts and cultural organisations to the tune of 2 million. So we forego 2 million in income to make sure that we can provide a secure, stable environment and space for a whole range of artists across a whole range of artistic disciplines. Pardon? For their purpose, for art's sake, because that's, we're there to support the cultural quarter. And so we provide the space which is so badly needed for artists to work in. And I think you'll find that, that one of the big things that the artistic community need is proper studio space, rehearsal space, workshop space, and that's what we provide. And we also provide performance venues for people to actually experience all of the cultural activity that happens in Temple Bar on a daily basis. On a broader issue, Culture Night is just the tip of the iceberg for us. As I say, it's a relatively new initiative, but what it has done has inspired over 20 towns, cities and counties right across Ireland to run their own culture nights. And what it has done is provided a whole new way for towns and cities to express themselves, to bring their cultural community together. And I think what we've done there is shown leadership and a new way of doing things, and that is very much driven as well by bringing added value to the public, putting public policy at the heart of what we do, so that our cultural programmes are about promoting access, participation, they're free of charge, and if we can pave the way in some way, which we seem to be doing because, as I say, it's been supported right across the country, then I think that we just need to kind of continue to keep doing what we're doing and to support, feed into any kind of development and strategic initiatives that are happening in Dublin and the city and Ireland, to make sure that culture and creative arts have their due place.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kate. I'm a postgraduate student here, and thank you very much for speaking. I just wanted to ask if we could broaden the discussion out a little bit, and I'd love to hear what Maurice has to say as well as yourself, Rania. We're talking a lot about creative approaches, and it's a fairly, what is it? What is a creative approach? What's creativity? What's the value of it? What's the end purpose, as you guys see it? Is it for social development? Is it economic development? And I'd be curious about how you relate that to leadership and how you see leadership functioning in that kind of discussion. I'd see leadership, a lot of these initiatives come from the government. They come from large cultural institutions, intellectual institutions, colleges. And it seems to be a very kind of top-down, hierarchical sort of approach. And I'm just wondering, do you think that's positive? Do you think that's the best way? Or is there room for more participatory, democratic, consultative approaches? Okay.
Maurice, top down, bottom up.
Is this working? Is this working?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. No, it isn't. You're saying no.
Yes,
you hear
it is.
It's kind of... Okay, we've sorted that out, thanks for that. So I run a business, so to some extent, when you run a business, you have to believe in the value of some top-down stuff, because there are some things when you run a business that have to come top-down. However, I think your question is an interesting one about creativity. I don't think that we can say there's one purpose to creativity. And again, a bit like I was saying with the humanities, I'm really, really glad that there are people in the world who think, act, and do things creatively sometimes for nothing that we would think of as a specific purpose, because in the end that generates some of the stuff that we're most proud of, and that can have the most transformational effect, perhaps even when we're least expecting it. I would say, however, that with regard to leadership, we're faced with a number of difficulties, whichever field we're in at the moment, whether you're leading a university, or you're leading a public institution, or you're leading a private sector organisation like I am. We're in a particular moment that's very, very, very challenging, where the kinds of things that we thought worked before are just not working anymore. And I think that as a result, two things are happening. I think people who are successful, first of all, are understanding that whereas creativity was a luxury before, it's an absolute necessity now. Because if you don't apply some kind of creativity and you continue to ask the same questions in the same way, you're going to get the same answers. And if those answers don't work, well, you better come up with different questions, because otherwise it's not going to work. And increasingly around me, I'm seeing that the people who are succeeding are those people who are prepared to embrace creativity, have the right kind of mindset for it, or even as leaders, aren't necessarily creative themselves, but recognise what it is in other people and allow it to flourish by leaving it alone. And the second thing that I think we're starting to see is that even people who run institutions are realising that they can't apply top-down ways of doing things alone, because society's changing, and again, the problems that we face are changing. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, I mean that people have kind of got a taste for understanding what it's like to start to talk to each other and solve their own problems. They've done that through the internet, they've done that through SMS, they've done that through a number of different technologies. They've done that also through a series of culture shifts. And I don't think that's going to go back again anytime soon. I think the genie's out of the bottle, and that's a great thing. I think the leaders of the future are going to be the people who understand how that works and can harness it rather than trying to resist it. And I think there's another reason for it, which is related to the first thing that I said. If we continue to have the same people answering the same questions in the same kinds of ways, we're going to get the same kinds of answers. And the problems that we face are just too big to allow that to happen. So I suppose I'm going to be a bit boring and say my answer to the question is I don't think that the era of top-down is completely dead. I do believe that there are very important situations in which it's necessary to have strong leadership and the ability to say that somebody or a group of people will make a decision, because sometimes the right way is the unpopular way. But I will also say that unless we embrace creativity and unless we embrace new ways of listening to people and creating the conditions for ordinary people to participate in that decision-making process, we're just going to fail.
Thank you. John, you want to follow up as well? No. All right, excellent. Jennifer.
Yeah, my name is Jennifer Edmond, and one of the things that struck me is sort of, for me, pulling your two talks together is the recognition that the economic language, apologies to the economists in the room, is sometimes goes towards economies of scale, which means that bigger is better. I'm thinking about both, Maurice, your example of the small SMS networks. Facts exist when they are shared, but not when they're shared too broadly, I would say. There's a tolerance in there. And Ronnie, you talked about how it was grassroots leadership, people coming together. There's a sort of a kind of a locality. There is an economy of scale, I think, for these kinds of things that work that is completely different from, you know, the massification of agriculture or these kind of the more widgets we can produce in this factory, the cheaper it is to produce each widget. Is this something that chimes with your experience, that there is actually a different scale at which at which culture is engaged with in an effective way? I mean, Culture Night was huge, but it was individual groups and individual places, and so I was just wondering if you could comment on this idea of the scale at which the arts, the cultures, the humanities makes an impact in these kinds of spheres.
Yeah, I guess from my own practical experience, like let's say getting Culture Night off the ground, for instance, as an example, I found that, I suppose going back to leadership, it kind of is
kind of, how to say, being able to kind of take the initiative and having the space, identifying the need for something different to happen, and getting a community of like-minded people together who are willing to actually test it and pilot it and see if it'll work. And I suppose that's kind of been my experience over the last, I suppose in general, like kind of working over the last 10 or 15 years. So it's hard, I suppose I kind of find it hard to speak on a broader level, but certainly it's like I find at the moment there seems to be quite a hunger among a number of cultural people in Dublin for a change to the common discourse, even to the way the arts are being talked about. Like there was a very successful national campaign for the arts which ran all last year, and a lot of the arguments were based around I suppose the economic benefits of the arts, and there are quite a few people, I suppose, who feel like that actually that doesn't really represent the true picture of what they believe the contribution that arts can make, culture can make. So there is kind of like this little counterculture of a small number of people who are a bit like in the temple of our days. They're meeting in coffee shops or talking online, Skyping, that kind of thing. So I suppose maybe the nature of the culture community is probably quite small as well. So that's kind of how, my experiences have kind of taken off.
Can I just follow that up a little bit? My name is Paul Camden. I'm a PhD candidate here. And I'm confused a little bit in that I think we have put the terms arts and culture together without delineating what they are. To me, culture is what happens when people get together in a social space, and for some people that involves the arts, and for some people that involves, quite frankly, getting drunk on Friday night. And so public space brings with it these contested claims, some of which are commercial, some people have suggested as well. And I think there's very often a tendency for people to say, well, you know, a cultural experience which involves the arts is really successful, and why can't it be like this all of the time, because I personally enjoyed this. Whereas the other people, including residents who have contested claims to that public space, may see it differently. And I worry about the idea of leadership and direction with all of those contested claims from different people. I wonder how that squares with your way of seeing it.
Okay, I'll let that sit for a moment, and Maurice, you won't get a chance to respond now, because we have a lot of interest out there. You first up there, and then I had somebody here, you, and further back up there, right.
Hello everybody, my name is John Carney and I'm an artist and I live and work in Dublin. I just want to throw out an analogy that the three-humped, five-legged camel started out as a thoroughbred Arab horse before the committee got its hands on it. And this was a famous analogy that was used in design school to authenticate and tell designers that they needed clarity of vision and acceptance of their leadership position when tasked to design something. And if they dissipated their authority to design something to the best of their ability, then everybody got a little bit of what they wanted. And the horse turned up as the three-humped camel. Everybody got their little bit, and nobody was particularly satisfied, and the end result was naff and useless. And I'd just like to throw out for the discussion here today that as a creative person, there is an enormous tension between the integrity of what we need to do as creative people. For instance, when I am hired by an organisation to create a work of art, and then the politics that are involved, particularly in larger scale organisations that may not like my vision, that might feel outraged by the type of work I do. And I think that in the nature of large-scale organisations trying to harness the work of creative people, they're going to have to acknowledge the leadership and the authenticity and almost the moral ring-fencing of the vision that creative person is going to bring to the process. Because when that doesn't occur, then eventually the process becomes muddied, and the eventual end result won't be as good as the original thinking behind it.
Thank you. You?
Yeah, hi, my name is Anya McCarthy and I'm a postgraduate student here in history. I come from a tourism background, so and I missed the first part of your presentation, so my apologies. So I've just a quick question for you, Grania. I've always had, out of my 20 years experience in working in tourism industry, 10 of those were abroad, States, Australia, Asia. A lot of people who I would have come into contact with obviously have visited Temple Bar, generally positive feedback, so that's always a good thing. One of the things that strikes me, and I don't know if there's somebody here from Tourism Ireland, is how that connectivity and what you all do, and what the arts and the humanities are trying to do, and that connecting into what we should be is our target markets, and target markets are really where we're about. We need to get the numbers up. And obviously you've had a shortfall in numbers with the reduction in, I suppose, the last 2 years, just things took a drop. But the core markets are probably still okay. Some places like the US and France and Germany, the higher spend. One of the things that always struck me, and it's the non-cohesiveness in terms of marketing campaigns, because when you're in different countries and you're seeing what Ireland is putting out as images, and then you're hearing from people who've been to the country and what they come back and tell you about what the country is. And I've always had a huge interest in this because it's basically a little bit back to the lady who's a resident. Not to disparage her comments, you're living there so you know what it's like. Yes, sometimes it's great, Temple Bar is great, but yeah, it can be a bit dirty, so that's probably some of the problem. But in a place like, if you compare I'm going to pick 3 very different places that I know a little bit about. New Zealand, Cambodia, California. Those 3 places, in very diverse places, have incredible marketing campaigns. They get their image marketing right, they get their target marketing right. A place like Cambodia can attract into a small airport like Siem Reap, which has got the Angkor Wat temples, 2 million people a year. Now, I'm not kidding you, that airport is so small, it's no bigger than Cork Airport, I'd say. And they get 2 million people a year, simply because their target marketing is so just pinned right down. And I just want to say, do you get to have an impact with Tourism Ireland? Because this is part of, this is where I have a frustration from somebody who now is studying history and connecting in tourism, history, arts, culture, heritage, where it's all going. And it's channeling all of that into Tourism Ireland to get the spend right in our target markets and get it right in terms of what people want to come here for. They want to come here to see Trinity. They want to come here to go to Temple Bar. They want to come and see, Georgia in Dublin. All of those things. They're the things and to experience the culture of it. And that's from my experience being in markets outside of Ireland. And I'm just wondering, do you have an impact with Tourism Ireland?
All right, and the last third.
It's sort of, again, thinking actually what Paul was saying up there. My name is Simone Cameron-Cohen. I'm a postgraduate student here at Trinity in English. I was finding that culture, when you were speaking about culture, was a very slippery term. It needs to be almost pluralized, cultures. You can't have it as a big definitive blob of a word. It doesn't work like that. There are too many contrasting cultures within Ireland, within Dublin, within Temple Bar, within all that area, and it is those contrasting cultures that create a dialogue, and it's from that dialogue I think that you get the energy and creativity that you will lead to problem solving, essentially bringing both of your ideas together. And diversification seems to be the key, while retaining, the sort of ideas of one individual group, but also having it contribute to the larger overall emphasis on the city or whatever that you are looking at. I find that idea of culture a little bit too broad, that it needs to be remembered that it has to be broken down into several different things that sometimes contrast and clash.
All right, who wants to go first? Ed and John, if you want to chip in, welcome.
I'm not sure how to respond to all of that because there were quite a lot of points, but perhaps just on this culture point, something that's maybe trivial but was quite fun the other day. We were doing a piece of work about culture for an organisation where we realised that we'd run into another problem because the organisation made the stuff that goes into yoghurt, and when we talked to them about culture, they thought we meant that. Anyway.
Well, just picking up on the point there about tourism, I think there's been quite some positive progress, I would say, being made in that front. Where Dublin Tourism, for instance, they have now set up a cultural tourism, and I'm on that, so I do get an opportunity to I suppose, to try and influence, I suppose, how culture is promoted overseas. I think one of the things that the tourism sector have found over the years is that it's quite difficult to engage with the cultural sector, and I think this does come back to definitions in some ways, because on the one hand, the value of talking about culture is the inclusivity and the ability to embrace the range of culture, not just the arts, which for some time seem in a sense to kind of have a monopoly on creativity. Whereas if you start thinking about like our churches and our cathedrals and places of historic interest and parks, and I suppose the value of keeping the definition loose is that it kind of means that there's something there for everybody. So the tourism agents have found it actually difficult to engage with the cultural sector at large to support that because of the fragmentation or the way it's kind of quite sectoral, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know, but it's hard in terms of designing policies and strategies to really kind of reflect the fullness and richness of culture when they kind of find it hard to reach us. But having said that, they have a whole new campaign now which is in place, and it's all based around living culture, so that in itself has other connotations. But I think it's a much more accurate reflection of contemporary Dublin as opposed to perhaps the more traditional ideas of the West of Ireland that are suitable for the West of Ireland, but they're not suitable for Dublin. You mentioned Tourism Ireland, and I was recently at the Fáilte Ireland conference around their strategy for this year, and it was very interesting because while the imagery and videos and ads to promote culture in Ireland, the Irish market are extremely vibrant and contemporary and exciting and dynamic. The ads for Tourism Ireland are Irish dancers on the crossroads of Castle Yard there in Dublin, just off Grafton Street, and fairies in tombstones around Glentalough. And I don't know who they're marketed to the Germans and the Americans, but even within the tourism agencies, their actual depiction of Ireland is completely worlds apart. So that is so important when it comes to people's experiences of Ireland and the whole area of expectations, I suppose, and what people are actually coming for. So that's my contribution there.
All right, Ed gets a chance to say something.
Two things. Oh, that's not working. Is that working? Can you hear me?
Yes.
No, I thought what John Carney said there was very interesting about how artists sort of bounce up against or come in contact with, I suppose, the corporate sector, I guess, is what you were talking about, really. And I think what you said was that it's very important that a kind of a moral circle is drawn around the artist so that the artist is free to do his or her work in the context of a commission. Am I right?
Yeah.
You're nodding your head.
Yeah.
And that's very interesting because actually it's that tension that is the meat and potatoes, the daily tension that exists in what I do as a film producer. Because on the one hand you're contending with creative people whose vision you hopefully admire and want to promote. But on the other hand, part of your job is to represent the industry, or sorry, not the industry, the audience, or to push that creative artist into a place where they communicate with the maximum number of people. And so that's just an inherent tension. What I suppose what I would say is that I think that tension is something that's necessary, that we'll never really be able to legislate for, and must exist for good work to be produced. Because I don't believe that if you just give let's say a blank check to an artist and say, do what you like, that necessarily produces the best work. I don't believe that. Equally, I absolutely, passionately don't believe that, if you like, that the commercial side of the equation should dominate. I think it's where those two match. The other observation I want, the other observation I want to make, I think it's very interesting what Biriotti said there about what Tourism Ireland and what images it uses when it sells to the Irish market versus what images it sells when it uses when it sells to the international market. And I experience this all the time, again, as a producer of film and television drama, is that actually what you know, we like to think we are this kind of thrusting European, modern, IDA, blah, blah, blah. You know, the posters you see when you arrive in Dublin Airport, you know, Innovation Island, all that kind of malarkey. But actually, in a weird way, other countries aren't really that interested in that image of us. I mean, the English still really think that when they think about what they want to see from Ireland, they kind of want Ballygusangel still. You know what I mean? They're not that interested in, you know, people puking in the streets of Temple Park. Not that they do anymore, of course. But they're not necessarily interested in the you know, the hyper contemporary versions of Ireland that we all like to think exist. And I think it's very interesting when you look at the films from Ireland that have been successful, with possibly one exception. And when you look at the films from Ireland that have been successful, they almost invariably deal with the IRA or the Catholic Church, which are icons of our history that we're all probably fed up with. But they still, they're actually the things that are very successful. You know, if you think, you know, from Jim Sheridan's movies to, you know, The Wind That Shakes the Barley or Magdalene Sisters or, and I suppose, you know, there are exceptions, Crying Game being another one. Once is an exception, and I suppose Once is a film that actually we're probably all feel reflects what we think of as Dublin, and did very well internationally. What's interesting about Once is it did pretty badly in Ireland.
All right, I know a lot of you have actually burning questions and comments. You will need to write them down. You've got a little piece of paper in front of you. Use it for your own purpose, or hand it over to one of us, or put it yourself up on the stickers outside. We'll try and collect all your post-its during the break and try and have that feed into the debate after the break. When we come back, we will, of course, be treated to 2 more perspectives on what has already turned out to be a really lively debate. I will leave you with one thought for the break. I happened to read a report by the Swedish Engineers Association, and they came up with one formula that would guarantee the success of your business in the future. It was not to do what 90% of the engineering companies were doing, namely employ engineers. The really, really successful businesses in Swedish engineering mixed to max. They needed to bring on artists, humanists, people trained in languages, in culture, in performance, to really ensure that the company had a much broader vision of human life. Otherwise, they were producing rubbish. And that's actually another thought to bring with us, that we shouldn't just talk about how we organize ourselves, it's also to mix with the others. But in between, we need a break, and you need to mix with each other. So we'll come back here at 5 to 4. We've eaten into the break, so we'll start again at 5 to 4.